The photograph stares back with the kind of stillness that makes you uncomfortable. Bessie Tyson's face holds no drama, no obvious clues to catastrophe. Yet somewhere between the moment this image was captured and the cold February morning when influenza finally claimed her at 58 years old, a life unraveled with such methodical precision that by the turn of the century, court clerks knew her name without consulting their ledgers. The question that haunts anyone examining her trajectory is brutally simple. How does someone born into security end up as a case study in systematic failure? Her beginnings offered no prophecy of disaster. September 15, 1870, arrived with Bessie drawing her first breath at 58 Carter Street in Toxteth Park, Liverpool. The address itself whispered respectability. Her father Miles worked as an accountant, a profession that in Victorian England carried weight beyond mere income. Accountants inhabited that precarious territory between manual labor and gentility. Men who dealt in numbers and ledgers, who wore clean collars and returned home with ink-stained fingers rather than coal dust under their nails. Louisa Tyson, born Gantlet, fulfilled the expected maternal role, though history recorded her primarily as an appendage to her husband's occupation. The significance of Miles signing the birth registry himself, rather than making a mark, cannot be overstated. Literacy remained aspirational for many in 1870, a generation removed from illiteracy being commonplace among the working masses. Miles possessed both literacy and numeracy, tools that separated him from dock workers and street hawkers. His professional title implied more than employment. It suggested membership in that anxious lower middle class that obsessed over appearances, education, and the maintenance of standards that separated them from those beneath. Toxteth Park suited this aspiration perfectly. The neighborhood housed families perpetually aware of their position. People who fretted over school attendance and dinner table manners, who measured success in incremental improvements and feared any slide backward. For an only child like Bessie, born into this environment, expectations crystallized early. She would receive proper schooling, develop appropriate skills, and eventually secure employment befitting a clerk's daughter. Perhaps as a governess, a shop assistant, or if fortune smiled, marriage to someone of equal or superior standing. The 1881 census captures this stability frozen in documentary form. The Tysons resided at 6 Alfred Place, still within Toxteth Park's boundaries. Miles had reached 44, Louisa matched his age, and 10-year-old Bessie appeared with no occupation listed. That absence signified exactly what respectable families desired: childhood preserved for education rather than labor. Compulsory schooling laws were tightening their grip, and a white-collar father in a decent neighborhood would naturally ensure his daughter received proper instruction. Nothing in this snapshot suggested impending catastrophe. Everything pointed toward continuity, modest comfort, and that peculiarly Victorian sense of knowing one's place while aspiring slightly higher. Then came the move that altered everything. Somewhere between 1881 and 1891, the Tyson family abandoned Liverpool for London, transplanting themselves to the capital's sprawling eastern districts. By the 1891 census, they occupied 62 Albion Road in Shoreditch, perched on that indefinite border where East End poverty met North London's working neighborhoods. The address change told multiple stories. Miles, now 55, no longer identified as an accountant but as a mere clerk. Whether this reflected honest description of unchanged work or genuine economic dissent remains ambiguous, but the downgrade in terminology mattered. In Victorian England, words carried freight. The shift from accountant to clerk suggested diminished prospects, reduced income, or both. Elizabeth, Bessie had become Elizabeth in official documents, appeared at 21, unmarried, and residing with her parents.
The census recorded no occupation for her. This absence could mean several things, none entirely reassuring. She might be assisting with household duties, a common role for unmarried daughters, though one that generated no income and no independence. She might be between positions, that euphemistic state suggesting either unfortunate timing or difficulties securing work. Or the family might have preferred certain types of employment remain invisible to official scrutiny.
Regardless, she existed in that precarious state familiar to thousands of young Victorian women. Adult but dependent, educated but unoccupied, waiting for marriage or respectable work while living under parental oversight in a city that offered both more opportunities and more dangers than provincial Liverpool ever had. 3 years after that census, the first public fracture appeared not in family records, but in newspaper columns, that most unforgiving of Victorian archives. September 1894 brought Bessie Tyson before North London Police Court, charged with drunk and disorderly conduct in Dalston Lane. The report described her as 21 years old, census ages often conflicted with newspaper accounts, residing on Albion Road with very respectable parents. That phrase, very respectable, echoed through the coverage with damning emphasis. Respectability had become the measuring stick against which her behavior appeared doubly shameful. The charge itself represented Victorian urban life at its most routine. Public drunkenness, disorderly behavior, police intervention. What elevated this incident beyond statistical anonymity was the journalist's casual observation that she had appeared before the court several times already on similar charges. By the time newspapers considered her newsworthy enough for column inches, a pattern had established itself. This was not a first offence prompting family crisis and magisterial mercy. This was repetition, behavior that had already worn grooves in the court's machinery. Bessie offered an explanation that landed somewhere between excuse and accusation. Her young man, employed as a draper's assistant, had provided the drink. The draper's assistant emerged as an almost theatrical figure in late Victorian social narratives, young men trapped in retail positions that promised respectability but delivered poverty wages and crushing tedium. Such men had access to shop floors during the day and cheap public houses at night, limited resources for courtship beyond treating a girl to drinks in establishments where watered spirits cost pennies. Whether Bessie's companion genuinely plied her with alcohol, or whether she shared willingly in consumption that both could ill afford, matters less than the fact that she felt compelled to shift blame onto a man who fit a convenient social type. Louisa Tyson appeared in court weeping, a performance of maternal despair that would have satisfied Victorian expectations of feminine distress. She told the magistrate that Bessie could not be trusted alone, that on the Thursday evening in question, her daughter had begged permission for a mere half-hour's walk, then met her friend and, as the magistrate phrased it with bureaucratic delicacy, consumed too much alcohol. Previous occasions had resulted in lenient treatment, warnings, small fines, releases into parental custody. This time the magistrate ordered remand for 1 week, explicitly so Bessie might experience what prison felt like. The logic underpinning this decision deserves examination. Late Victorian criminal justice operated on the assumption that deterrence worked through escalation. If warnings failed, try fines. If fines failed, try brief imprisonment. If brief imprisonment failed, try slightly longer imprisonment. The system possessed neither imagination nor flexibility, only a grinding faith that enough discomfort would eventually produce compliance. That this approach rarely worked for habitual offenders troubled nobody in authority. The machinery had to keep processing bodies through cells and courtrooms because no alternative infrastructure existed. Stripped of its moralizing framework, the situation revealed a 21-year-old woman living with anxious parents, repeatedly sneaking out to drink with a boyfriend her family likely disapproved of, then returning home intoxicated or being picked up by constables before she made it back. Her parents were terrified, the courts irritated, the newspapers entertained by the contrast between respectable origins and disreputable behavior. In a later era, this might be recognized as a family struggling with a daughter's addiction. In 1894, it registered as a disciplinary problem requiring judicial correction. 3 years passed before she reappeared in the public record, though whether those years contained arrests that went unreported or periods of relative stability remains unknowable. 1897 brought another appearance before the bench for drunk and disorderly conduct. This time, when asked where she wished to go instead of prison, Bessie requested the workhouse. That response illuminates her understanding of the institutional landscape available to women in her circumstances. The workhouse existed under poor law provisions theoretically designed to provide relief for the destitute. In practice, these institutions functioned as deterrents, deliberately made unpleasant to discourage applicants. Life inside meant sex-segregated dormitories, regimented schedules, uniforms that marked inmates as paupers, labor that generated institutional income while providing minimal training, and crushing boredom punctuated by moral lectures. If Bessie preferred workhouse admission to prison, either she believed the former offered marginally better conditions, or she had reached a point where poor law oversight seemed preferable to repeated jail terms. The magistrate rejected her request outright, sentencing her to 1 month's hard labor instead. To prevent her entering the system designed for the destitute and chronically unwell, the court chose straightforward punishment. The logic held only if one accepted drunkenness as primarily moral failure, requiring moral correction, rather than a medical condition demanding treatment. Victorian authorities embraced this view with enthusiasm that rarely wavered, despite consistent evidence that imprisonment did nothing to address habitual drinking. By 1898, the tone of newspaper coverage shifted from routine crime reporting to expressions of social anxiety bordering on panic. November that year brought Bessie, now identified as 26 and still residing with her respectable parents on Albion Road, before the court charged with being drunk and incapable in Dalston Lane. A constable helpfully informed the magistrate that this represented her 16th charge for drunkenness at that specific court during the current year alone. 16 charges in 12 months suggested someone spending more time in cells than in any stable housing. It indicated a life utterly consumed by the cycle of drinking, arrest, brief imprisonment, release, and immediate return to the same patterns. Bessie told the court she had only just completed a 21-day sentence and that poor nutrition in prison meant even small amounts of alcohol affected her powerfully. The statement carried both dark humor and genuine insight into the revolving door that had become her existence. Prison weakened her physically through inadequate diet and lack of fresh air. Release deposited her back into the same environment that had led to arrest in the first place, but now in a more vulnerable state. The same quantity of cheap gin that might barely affect a well-fed person hit her diminished system with magnified force. She understood the trap, even if the magistrate did not, or would not. The magistrate on this occasion acknowledged that short imprisonment terms produced no positive effect and referenced the new Inebriates Act scheduled to take force soon. This 1898 legislation allowed for dramatically extended detention, up to 3 years, in specialized reformatories for individuals deemed habitual inebriates. To qualify, one needed multiple convictions for drink-related offences within a defined period. Bessie, with 16 convictions in a single year, essentially embodied the type of case the legislation aimed to address. Newspaper accounts remained obsessed with her parents' respectability. Her father maintained respectable city employment. Both parents had exhausted every possible means to reform their daughter through kindness and intervention, yet nothing worked. At every turn, the narrative positioned Bessie as the problem, never examining the environment producing such cases. Late Victorian London offered cheap alcohol everywhere, while providing almost nothing resembling modern addiction treatment. Respectable employment options for women remained severely limited. The idea that psychological or physiological factors might drive compulsive drinking existed only in nascent medical literature that had not penetrated judicial thinking. The magistrate released her that day with warnings about the new law. Framed as mercy, it functioned more as threat. Next appearance might bring not another 3 weeks, but years of confinement in institutions designed to break habitual behavior through isolation and regimentation. The message was clear. The system's patience was exhausting itself. 1899 brought what newspapers described as her 9th appearance that year at the same court for drunken and disorderly conduct. The magistrate remarked that Bessie ought to be confined as a dipsomaniac, the period's clinical term for compulsive drinkers, but added with apparent regret that no facility existed to receive her. The Inebriates Act had passed, but its infrastructure remained incomplete. Reformatories were being established, but beds remained scarce and admission criteria bureaucratically complex. So the court did what it always did, imposed another short sentence and sent her back into the cycle. By 1900, the newspapers were tracking her arrests with the same attention paid to recurring criminals and public nuisances. One report noted she had been before the court constantly for the last 6 years, accumulating convictions at a pace that suggested alcohol had become not merely a problem, but the organizing principle of her existence. Every aspect of her life now oriented around obtaining drink, consuming it, and dealing with the legal consequences. Employment became impossible to maintain. Stable housing dissolved. The respectable family connections that newspapers continued to mention served mainly as narrative contrast, proof that her situation resulted from personal failing rather than structural inadequacy. January 1901 delivered the scene frozen in that thumbnail photograph. Bessie Tyson at 28, securing her 42nd conviction for drunkenness at North London Police Court. The magistrate described her as young but incorrigible, that particularly damning assessment suggesting someone beyond redemption despite relative youth. 42 convictions represented an extraordinary number, even for courts accustomed to processing habitual offenders. It meant years of near constant interaction with police and magistrates, a paper trail documenting systematic failure of deterrence-based justice. The photograph itself likely came from this period, part of the identification procedures being refined as authorities attempted to track repeat offenders more efficiently. Photography was revolutionizing criminal record-keeping, allowing police to maintain visual registries that supplemented written descriptions. Bessie's image joined thousands of others, faces catalogued and filed, evidence that the state was watching even if it had no idea what to do with the information beyond continued punishment. Then came 1903, and the moment when official patience finally snapped. After yet another arrest for drunkenness, Bessie found herself not facing another few weeks in cells, but formal commitment under the Inebriates Act. The state had constructed its reformatory system, and she qualified emphatically for admission. Her conviction count had by this point exceeded 50 separate offences at North London Police Court alone, an achievement of such dubious distinction that magistrates had run out of incremental responses. She was sentenced to 3 years in a certified inebriate reformatory, a term that would consume her late 20s and deposit her into her 30s institutionalized, monitored, and supposedly reformed. The reformatory selected was Farmfield in Surrey, one of several institutions occupying uncomfortable territory between prison and hospital. These establishments offered work programs, religious instruction, rigid daily schedules, and what passed for treatment in an era that understood addiction poorly, if at all. In practice, they functioned as prisons with additional moralizing literature and mandatory chapel attendance. The theory held that separating habitual drunkards from their usual haunts and denying them alcohol access for extended periods would produce reformed individuals ready to rejoin society as productive citizens. This assumed optimistically that addiction stemmed primarily from bad company and insufficient willpower, rather than complex psychological and physiological factors that would not be properly understood for decades. The reformatory regime emphasized routine, labor, and moral improvement. Inmates rose early, attended prayers, worked in laundries or kitchens or gardens, ate plain food in silence, and retired early to sex-segregated dormitories under supervision. Contact with the outside world was severely restricted, letters censored, visitors rare, newspapers forbidden. The goal was creating a controlled environment utterly unlike the chaotic urban streets where drink beckoned from every public house. Whether this environment produced anything beyond enforced sobriety during confinement remained perpetually questionable. Recidivism rates were discussed in reformatory annual reports, with careful phrasing that suggested disappointing outcomes, without stating them explicitly. While Bessie served her 3-year term somewhere in Surrey's institutional landscape, catastrophe visited her family. July 1905 brought Miles Tyson's death at Shoreditch Infirmary. He was 64 years old, his occupation recorded not as accountant or even clerk, but as general laborer, a designation suggesting the complete collapse of whatever economic security he had once maintained. His death certificate listed rheumatoid arthritis, chronic Bright's disease, kidney failure, and exhaustion as causes of death. That final word, exhaustion, carried weight. It suggested a man worn down by decades of anxious labor, by the move from Liverpool that never delivered promises prosperity, by watching his only child descend into alcoholism while Victorian society offered no help beyond punishment. Louisa likely survived him briefly, though records provide no clear death date. By the time Bessie completed her reformatory sentence and returned to London, both parents had vanished from the living world. The respectable household that once defined her social position had dissolved entirely. She emerged from farm field with no family support, no home to return to, and a conviction record that made legitimate employment nearly impossible to secure. Whatever slim chances existed for rebuilding a conventional life had evaporated during her institutional confinement. The state briefly entertained optimism about her prospects. Reformatory officials documented her release with notes suggesting institutional success. She had completed the full term, demonstrated compliant behavior, absorbed moral instruction. The paperwork implied transformation. Reality delivered something quite different. 1906 brought Bessie back before North London Police Court for drunk and disorderly conduct in Dalston Lane, the same stretch of street where constables had arrested her countless times before. She was now in her mid-30s, described in newspaper coverage as having well-to-do connections, a phrase that rang increasingly hollow given her circumstances. The assistant jailer informed the court that she had accumulated over 50 convictions at that venue for drunkenness and had already completed 3 years at Farmfield Reformatory. The magistrate announced with evident frustration that every sort of sentence and treatment had been attempted and all had failed. He imposed 1 month's hard labor, a return to short punitive sentences that had never worked previously and showed no signs of working now. The pattern revealed itself with brutal clarity. The reformatory system claimed to treat addiction through separation and discipline, yet women emerged from these institutions and promptly returned to the exact behaviors that had led to their confinement. Either the treatment was fundamentally flawed, or the conditions awaiting released inmates made sobriety impossible to maintain, or both factors combined to ensure failure. Nobody in authority seemed particularly interested in examining this dynamic. The institutions existed, they processed their assigned populations, officials filed reports documenting compliance with procedures, and when inmates reoffended after release, the blame landed entirely on individual moral deficiency. By early 1907, Bessie had officially transitioned from problem drinker to police problem. Reports that year described her as a woman with no fixed abode, who had appeared more than 50 times at North London Police Court, charged with drunk and disorderly conduct. The jailer explained that for more than half her life, a staggering phrase when applied to someone in her 30s, she had cycled through prisons, had been placed on the blacklist that legally prevented publicans from serving her alcohol, and had already completed one 3-year reformatory term. The blacklist deserves particular attention as it illuminated the contradictions embedded in how Victorian society approached chronic drunkenness. Authorities recognized that cutting off alcohol supply might help certain individuals, yet enforcement remained haphazard, and determined drinkers could always find willing sellers or alternative sources. The magistrate mused that she should return to reformatory care. Bessie replied with devastating resignation that if he insisted she must go, then she supposed she must. That exchange captured the complete exhaustion of all involved. Magistrates tired of seeing the same face, police tired of the same arrests, and Bessie herself tired of a life that had become nothing but institutional cycling. She no longer protested or offered excuses or blamed young men for providing drink. She had moved beyond that into passive acceptance that the state would do with her whatever it deemed necessary. March 6, 1907 brought formal entry in the Habitual Drunkard Register, one of those bureaucratic documents that attempted to bring order to the chaos of repeat offenders. Bessie Tyson, age 33, no fixed abode, described now as a prostitute. The occupational designation marked another descent. Whether she had been trading sex for money or shelter during the period between arrests, or whether police simply applied that label to homeless women with drinking problems remains unclear. Victorian authorities frequently categorize women found drunk on the streets as prostitutes, regardless of actual circumstances. The logic being that respectable women did not become homeless drunkards. Therefore, any woman in that condition must be selling sex. The physical description noted scars on forehead and neck, missing teeth in the upper jaw. These details documented the bodily toll extracted by years of rough living, police encounters, and prison conditions. Scars accumulated from falls while intoxicated, from altercations, from accidents in cells or on the street. Missing teeth resulted from poor nutrition, lack of dental care, violence, or all three. Her body was becoming a text, recording deprivation and damage. She was committed for 3 years to Eastern County's Inebriates Reformatory, a different institution, but identical in purpose and method to Farmfield. The authorities had decided that since one reformatory had failed to produce lasting change, perhaps another would succeed. This logic ignored all evidence suggesting the problem lay not in which specific institution held her, but in the fundamental approach to treating addiction through enforced confinement and moral lectures. 1910 brought her third appearance in the Habitual Drunkard Register. Now 36 years old, still without fixed address, she was described this time as a machinist, suggesting she had secured some form of employment between reformatory releases, likely in one of the East End's sweatshops, where women operated sewing machines for piece-rate wages under brutal conditions. The work was mind-numbing and physically punishing, but it required no references and asked few questions. For women with extensive criminal records, such employment often represented the only option beyond the streets or the workhouse. Yet again she received commitment to a certified inebriate reformatory for 3 years following another conviction. The scars documented in the register continued accumulating. The labels attached to her occupation changed: prostitute, machinist, charwoman, reflecting the unstable and desperate nature of work available to women in her circumstances. The underlying pattern never varied. She would be arrested drunk, sentenced to reformatory confinement, serve her time, emerge back into the same environment with the same limited options, and within weeks or months be arrested again.
If one attempts the grim arithmetic of her sentences, the numbers become staggering. By 1903, she had already spent years cycling through short prison terms, days and weeks adding up to months of her 20s consumed in cells.
Between 1903 and 1913, she served at least 3 separate 3-year terms in reformatories, 9 years total, plus additional imprisonment filling the gaps between institutional commitments. A substantial portion of her 30s was spent in custody under various administrative labels: prisoner, inmate, inebriate, reformatory case. Yet her crime remained essentially unchanged throughout, being drunk in public spaces or on licensed premises repeatedly in a society that possessed no conceptual framework for addiction beyond willful misconduct requiring punishment. The reformatory system claimed therapeutic purpose, but functioned as warehouse storage for inconvenient people. Women entered these institutions and disappeared from public view for years at a time, emerging with institutional habits, references to religious conversion that satisfied administrators, and absolutely no preparation for navigating the world that had defeated them before confinement. The reformatories taught laundry work, basic sewing, scripture memorization, and obedience to authority. They did not address why women drank compulsively, what psychological pain drove them toward alcohol, how poverty and limited options and gendered expectations created circumstances where drinking offered one of the few available pleasures or escapes. The system preferred moral categories to material analysis. After 1910, the paper trail documenting Bessie's existence grows thin and intermittent. Court records that once tracked her with bureaucratic precision suddenly fall silent. Either she finally achieved some measure of stability that kept her away from police attention, or her arrest stopped being considered newsworthy enough for papers to report. Chronic offenders became familiar background noise in London's judicial machinery, their cases processed with minimal commentary unless something exceptional occurred. For a woman who had once generated headlines contrasting her respectable origins with her degraded present, being ignored by newspapers might actually have represented improvement. She disappeared back into London's vast anonymous population, the lodging houses where nightly rent was collected and no questions asked, the casual labor markets where women gathered hoping for a day's work in laundries or as chars cleaning wealthier people's homes, the streets and alleys of the East End where poverty was not exceptional but ordinary. In neighborhoods like Stepney, Shoreditch, Bethnal Green, women like Bessie were unremarkable. Every tenement held residents with drinking problems, criminal records, histories of workhouse or prison stays. What seemed scandalous in newspaper reports appeared utterly normal in the lived reality of London's poorest districts. The lack of records during this period might also suggest something darker. Deterioration so complete that even the minimal documentation following chronic offenders ceased to capture her. Perhaps she had moved beyond the reach of institutions that still maintained some bureaucratic interest in reform. Perhaps her health had declined to the point where she spent time in infirmaries rather than prisons. Perhaps she simply learned to drink more carefully, avoiding the public disorder charges that had previously brought police attention. The silence in the archives can mean many things, none of them entirely reassuring. What eventually brings her back into documentary visibility is not arrest or institutional commitment, but death. February 15, 1929. Bessie Tyson's life concludes in East London. The death certificate recorded her as 62 years old, a spinster, a charwoman residing at 37 Tredegar Square in Stepney. The cause of death was listed as influenza and bronchopneumonia, medical conditions that in 1929 still killed thousands annually, particularly among the elderly poor living in crowded, unsanitary housing with inadequate heating and nutrition. The age notation was incorrect. Born in 1870, she was actually 58 at death, not 62. Such discrepancies were entirely standard for late-life death registrations of single marginal women. Nobody present when she died possessed authoritative knowledge of her birth date. No family remained to correct the information. The registrar recorded what seemed plausible based on appearance and second-hand information. In the grand scheme of bureaucratic errors, this was trivial. Yet it underscores how thoroughly Bessie had been severed from her origins. Even her birth year became uncertain, one more casualty of her long descent. The occupation listed as charwoman indicated she had found work in the years before her death, the kind of brutal manual labor that broke bodies and paid barely enough for rent and food. Charwomen scrubbed floors, cleaned toilets, hauled water and coal, performed the invisible labor that kept middle-class homes functioning. The work required no skills beyond willingness to destroy one's hands and back for a few shillings. For aging women with no family support and questionable pasts, it was often the only employment available. That Bessie died with an address rather than in the workhouse or on the street suggested she had managed to maintain at least minimal economic stability in her final years, enough to rent a room and avoid complete destitution. Tredegar Square in Stepney was the kind of address that told its own story. Stepney in the late 1920s remained densely packed with the working poor, dockers, factory labourers, market porters, charwomen, flower sellers, people who worked exhausting hours for inadequate pay and counted themselves fortunate if they avoided the workhouse. The square itself would have been lined with tenements subdivided into single rooms, shared water closets in courtyards, walls thin enough to hear neighbours through them, endemic damp causing respiratory ailments that killed with grim regularity. Influenza and bronchopneumonia represented common killers in overcrowded urban poverty during this era. Bessie likely fell ill during one of the harsh winter outbreaks that swept through London's poorest neighbourhoods, her weakened system unable to mount effective resistance. Years of poor nutrition, alcohol consumption, institutional confinement, and manual labour had extracted their toll. The body that had once been that of a clerk's carefully raised daughter had been ground down by decades of deprivation. When illness struck, there was no reserve left, no family to ensure proper care, no resources for medical treatment beyond whatever the local charity dispensary might provide. The death certificate made no mention of alcohol, no reference to her decades of arrests and confinements. In death, she achieved the administrative cleanliness that had eluded her in life. The state recorded her demise with the same bureaucratic indifference it brought to all working-class deaths: name, age, occupation, cause, done. After all those sensational newspaper headlines about hopeless inebriates and respectable families shamed by wayward daughters, her end was medically mundane. She became what the system had always wanted: a closed file, a concluded case, a problem that had resolved itself through mortality. What remains is the question of interpretation. How should anyone examining this trajectory understand what happened? The Victorian and Edwardian press had clear answers. Bessie was incorrigible, a moral failure, someone who had squandered advantages through weakness of character. Her respectable parents had done everything possible, yet she had chosen degradation. This narrative satisfied audiences eager to believe that poverty and alcoholism resulted from individual failings rather than structural problems. If Bessie was simply bad, then nothing needed to change beyond punishing such people more effectively. Yet that explanation collapses under scrutiny. The daughter of a Liverpool accountant did not wake one morning and decide to become one of North London's most arrested women. Something happened during those years between the 1881 census, showing a carefully educated child, and the 1894 arrest reports, documenting an established pattern of drunkenness. What precisely occurred remains locked in the silence, where private family history disappeared unrecorded. Perhaps there was trauma, sexual assault, violence, loss that never made it into official documents. Perhaps there was mental illness, depression or anxiety that manifested in self-medication through alcohol in an era that had no language for such conditions. Perhaps the move from Liverpool to London shattered social connections and replaced them with isolation. Perhaps the limited options available to educated lower-middle-class women created suffocating pressure that alcohol temporarily relieved. Victorian London offered cheap gin everywhere while providing almost nothing resembling modern addiction treatment. A woman with money might access private sanitariums that claim to treat nervous conditions and habits of intoxication. A woman without money received police cells, magistrates' lectures, and reformatory confinement. The medical understanding of addiction as a disease, rather than moral failing, existed only in nascent form within specialist literature that had not yet influenced judicial practice. Courts operated on the assumption that punishment would deter, that enough discomfort would break patterns, that separation from drink through imprisonment or reformatory commitment would produce reformed individuals. The consistent failure of this approach troubled nobody sufficiently to question fundamental assumptions. The response was viciously gendered. Male drunkenness received treatment as nuisance, something to be fined or briefly jailed, then released. Female drunkenness triggered moral panic. Women who drank to excess were not merely breaking public order ordinances, they were violating fundamental expectations of feminine behavior. Respectable Victorian womanhood demanded sobriety, modesty, domestic focus, sexual purity. A drunk woman in the street represented the inversion of everything proper femininity supposedly embodied. Therefore, such women merited not brief punishment, but extended confinement. Reformatory regimes designed to reconstruct personality and behavior. Permanent placement on police radar as threats requiring monitoring. That Bessie accumulated over 50 convictions speaks not only to her drinking, but to police practices and judicial priorities. Constables patrolling Dalston Lane knew her face, arrested her reflexively, brought her before magistrates who knew her name without consulting records. She became a familiar fixture in the machinery of criminal justice, someone who could be processed quickly and efficiently, a regular feature of court dockets. Other women with similar drinking patterns who lived in different neighborhoods or who had different relationships with local police might never accumulate comparable conviction totals. The number of arrests reflected both her behavior and the attention she received from authorities. The reformatory sentences, 3 separate 3-year terms documented, represented the full force of the Inebriates Act applied to someone authorities deemed the perfect candidate for such measures. She had the conviction count, the pattern of behavior, the failure to respond to lesser interventions. She embodied everything the legislation aimed to address. Yet she also demonstrated the legislation's fundamental inadequacy. 9 years in reformatories produced no lasting change, because reformatories addressed symptoms rather than causes, isolation rather than underlying conditions, moral instruction rather than medical treatment. When authorities placed Bessie on the blacklist, preventing publicans from serving her, they acknowledged implicitly that environment mattered, that cutting off alcohol supply might help. Yet the blacklist functioned poorly because enforcement depended on publicans recognizing banned individuals and caring enough to refuse service when every sale meant profit. Determined drinkers found willing sellers or purchased bottles from off-licenses or obtained alcohol through friends. The blacklist offered symbolic control without meaningful effect, another administrative measure that looked rational on paper while accomplishing little in practice. The occupation labels attached to Bessie shifted across documents: prostitute, machinist, charwoman, each one telling a story about survival strategies available to women with extensive criminal records. Prostitution, whether accurately applied or simply assumed by police, represented one of few options for homeless women needing immediate money. Machinist work in sweatshops required no references, and asked no questions, but paid starvation wages for mind-numbing labor. Char work was even less stable. Day-to-day casual employment dependent on finding someone willing to hire. None of these occupations offered paths toward stability. All were survival tactics for people operating outside or on the furthest margins of respectable working-class life. That she died with an address and an occupation suggests that in her final years she had achieved something approximating stability, even if that stability meant scrubbing other people's floors while living in a Stepney tenement. The decades of institutional cycling had apparently ended. Either her drinking had moderated enough to avoid police attention, or she had become too old and broken for authorities to bother arresting. The silence in the records after 1910 could mean many things, but the death certificate suggests she had managed to construct some minimal existence that kept her housed and employed until influenza claimed her. The photograph that began this examination stares back across a century with no answers written on its surface. Bessie Tyson's face reveals nothing about internal experience, about what drove her toward alcohol repeatedly despite knowing the consequences, about whether she found any moments of peace or pleasure or meaning in the decades between her respectable childhood and her obscure death. The image serves as evidence that she existed, that authorities considered her worthy of documentation, that at some point someone aimed a camera and captured her likeness for filing with other faces of people the state was tracking. What the historical record reveals is not individual pathology, but systemic failure. A society that criminalized addiction rather than treating it, that cycled people through institutions without addressing root causes, that blamed individuals for problems created by structural inadequacy. The reformatories claimed therapeutic purpose, but functioned as warehouses. The courts claimed to pursue rehabilitation, but delivered only punishment. The newspapers claimed to document social problems, but served primarily to reinforce prejudices about moral failing and personal responsibility. Bessie's story demonstrates how late Victorian and Edwardian England handled people who could not or would not conform to expectations of sober respectability. The approach was mechanical: arrest, convict, confine, release, repeat. Nobody asked why young women from lower middle-class families developed destructive relationships with alcohol. Nobody examined whether poverty and limited options and gendered constraints created environments where drinking offered one of few available escapes. Nobody questioned whether punishment-based responses might actually worsen problems by ensuring released inmates returned to the same circumstances with even fewer resources and opportunities. The respectable parents repeatedly invoked in newspaper coverage, her father with his city employment, her mother with her tearful court appearances, served as narrative devices emphasizing the tragedy of wasted potential. They had done everything correctly according to Victorian middle-class values, maintained stable employment, educated their only child, worried about standards and propriety. Yet their daughter had descended into chronic alcoholism anyway. The press used this contrast to reinforce messages about individual responsibility. Bessie's failure seemed especially damning because she had supposedly been given advantages that many lacked. Yet that framing ignored crucial context. Miles Tyson's descent from Liverpool accountant to London clerk to dying as a general labourer suggested economic insecurity masked by claims of respectability. The family's move to London might have represented not opportunity, but desperation. An attempt to escape financial problems that followed them south and worsened. Bessie came of age in a household experiencing downward mobility, watching her father's status erode while maintaining appearances that respectability demanded. The stress of that situation, pretending everything was fine while circumstances deteriorated, might have created unbearable pressure for which alcohol offered temporary relief. The complete absence of information about what triggered her initial drinking remains the most frustrating gap in the historical record. Something happened between the 1881 census showing a 10-year-old schoolgirl and the 1894 arrest reports describing an established pattern of drunkenness. Those 13 years contained the transformation, but the transformation itself went unrecorded. Families did not discuss such matters openly.
Private crises remained private until they exploded into public scandals that newspapers could report.
Whatever caused Bessie to start drinking compulsively, whether trauma, mental illness, bad company, simple availability of cheap alcohol, or complex combinations of factors, disappeared into the historical silence surrounding working-class women's interior lives. The Inebriates Act of 1898 represented Parliament's attempt to address chronic drunkenness through what appeared to be enlightened policy, treatment rather than mere punishment, long-term intervention rather than repeated short sentences. Yet the legislation's actual implementation revealed the gap between reformist rhetoric and punitive reality. The reformatories established under the Act functioned as prisons with additional moral instruction. They offered no medical treatment for addiction because medicine had not yet developed effective interventions. They provided no psychological counseling because psychology, as a clinical discipline, barely existed. What they offered was isolation, routine, labor, religious lectures, and the hope that prolonged abstinence would somehow rewire behavior permanently. This hope was consistently disappointed. Recidivism rates among reformatory graduates remained stubbornly high, though official reports tended to emphasize success stories while downplaying failures. The problem was structural rather than individual. Releasing someone back into the exact environment and circumstances that had produced their drinking problem virtually guaranteed return to old patterns. Yet reformatories could not address environmental factors. They could control what happened within their walls, but had no mechanism for ensuring stable housing, employment, social support, or ongoing supervision after release. Women emerged from 3-year terms and found themselves on London streets with no money, no connections, and criminal records that made legitimate employment nearly impossible to secure. The comparison between male and female treatment under these systems deserves emphasis. Men arrested for drunkenness typically received overnight detention or small fines. Magistrates viewed male drinking as natural if sometimes excessive, something to be managed rather than eliminated. Women arrested for the same behavior faced far harsher scrutiny. Female drunkenness violated fundamental assumptions about feminine nature and proper womanhood. Therefore, women like Bessie received extended reformatory sentences, while men with comparable or worse drinking problems cycled through brief punishments and returned quickly to the streets. This gendered double standard reflected deeper anxieties about women's roles and behavior. Victorian ideology positioned women as moral guardians of home and family, naturally more refined and self-controlled than men. A drunk woman represented not merely a public order problem, but a challenge to fundamental beliefs about gender and morality. She had failed at the essential feminine task of maintaining virtue and respectability. Therefore, she required not just punishment, but reformation, an attempt to reconstruct her character and behavior to conform with proper feminine ideals. The language used in court reports and newspaper accounts reinforced these assumptions constantly. Bessie was incorrigible, hopeless, a lost woman, someone who had thrown away advantages and shamed respectable parents. The discourse was thoroughly moralistic, focused on personal failing rather than social context. Nobody discussed whether adequate support systems might have prevented her initial descent into alcoholism. Nobody questioned whether the lack of respectable employment options for unmarried, lower-middle-class women might have contributed to her situation. Nobody examined whether the move from Liverpool to London had disrupted social networks that might have provided stability. The medical profession was beginning to develop models of addiction as disease rather than moral failing, but this thinking had not yet influenced judicial practice. Courts continued operating on assumptions rooted in Victorian morality, that drunkenness reflected weak character, that punishment would deter, that extended confinement would break bad habits. The evidence that these approaches did not work accumulated steadily, but produced no meaningful policy changes. Reformatories continued operating, courts continued sentencing habitual drunkards to multi-year terms, and recidivism rates remained high. What might have helped Bessie remains a speculative question, given the limitations of the era. Modern addiction treatment emphasizes medical intervention, psychological counseling, peer support groups, and addressing underlying mental health conditions. None of this existed in any meaningful form during Bessie's lifetime. What did exist was an extensive apparatus of control and punishment masquerading as treatment. The reformatories claimed to offer care, while functioning primarily as institutions of confinement designed to remove problematic individuals from public view for extended periods. Her parents' deaths while she was institutionalized severed the last connection to her origins. When she emerged from Farmfield in the mid-1900s, she returned to a London where nobody remembered her as Miles Tyson's daughter from a respectable household in Toxteth Park. She was simply another middle-aged woman with a drinking problem and a criminal record, competing for casual labor and cheap lodging in neighborhoods where such women were unremarkable.
The transformation was complete. From carefully educated only child to anonymous urban poor, from someone with family connections and respectable prospects to someone utterly alone, navigating survival at the margins. The scars documented in Habitual Drunkard Registers told their own story. Each mark represented an incident: a fall while intoxicated, a fight, an accident, violence from police or fellow inmates, or street encounters. Her body became a text recording decades of rough living, each scar a sentence in a narrative of deterioration. The missing teeth resulted from poor nutrition, lack of dental care, and possibly violence. By her 30s, her appearance would have marked her clearly as someone from the urban poor, someone whose body showed the wear of poverty and addiction in ways that made respectable employment impossible, even if her criminal record had not already closed those doors. The question of what sustained Bessie through decades of this existence admits no easy answer. The historical record offers arrest dates, conviction numbers, institutional commitments, but provides no access to internal experience. Whether she found any pleasure in drinking beyond temporary escape, whether she maintained friendships or connections that went unrecorded, whether she experienced moments of hope or resigned herself entirely to her circumstances, all of this remains locked in the past, beyond recovery. What survives is only the administrative skeleton, the paperwork generated by her repeated collisions with legal and institutional systems. Yet even that skeletal record reveals patterns that transcend individual biography. Bessie's trajectory was not unique. Late Victorian and Edwardian police courts processed thousands of women on similar charges, women who accumulated conviction counts that testified to the failure of deterrence-based justice. The newspaper archives from this period overflow with cases of habitual drunkards receiving their 20th, 30th, 40th convictions, while magistrates expressed frustration that nothing seemed to work. The individual names changed, but the pattern remained constant: arrest, brief imprisonment, release, rearrest, with occasional longer reformatory sentences interrupting but never stopping the cycle. The economic dimension of this system deserves examination. Processing habitual offenders through courts, prisons, and reformatories consumed substantial public resources while producing minimal positive outcomes. The administrative machinery required to track repeat offenders, maintain reformatory institutions, and cycle the same individuals through cells year after year represented a significant investment in a failed approach. Yet, alternative frameworks barely existed. Charitable organizations offered some assistance, but operated with limited resources and religious agendas that often emphasized moral reformation over practical support. The state had constructed an elaborate apparatus for punishment and confinement, but almost nothing for treatment or prevention.
The geographic concentration of arrests in particular areas like Dalston Lane reflected policing priorities and neighbourhood characteristics. Working-class districts received heavy police presence, focused on maintaining public order through aggressive enforcement of drunk and disorderly statutes. Middle-class neighbourhoods with private drinking spaces experienced far less police scrutiny. A wealthy woman drinking heavily in her own home faced no legal consequences whatsoever. A poor woman drinking in the street faced immediate arrest. The law theoretically applied equally, but enforcement was thoroughly class-based.
Bessie's descent also illuminated the precariousness of lower middle-class respectability. Her father's status as an accountant had provided enough security for a comfortable childhood, but not enough to survive economic disruption. The move to London and Miles's occupational downgrade from accountant to clerk to general labourer traced a path downward that thousands of Victorian families experienced. Economic security was always fragile for the lower middle class, dependent on continued employment and vulnerable to illness, industrial changes, or simple bad fortune. When that security collapsed, families fell rapidly through the class structure, with few safety nets to arrest the descent. For women, the fall was especially precipitous. Men could seek unskilled labor, dock work, street peddling, any number of rough occupations that would at least provide subsistence income. Women's options narrowed dramatically to domestic service, sweated trades like machining, char work, or prostitution. Each of these came with severe limitations. Domestic service required references and good character, impossible for anyone with a criminal record. Sweated trades paid starvation wages for exhausting labor. Char work was casualized and unreliable. Prostitution carried enormous risks and social stigma. None offered paths toward stability or security. The institutional apparatus that processed Bessie, police courts, prisons, reformatories, workhouses, represented Victorian society's organized response to poverty, deviance, and disorder. These institutions claimed to address social problems, but functioned primarily to manage and contain problematic populations. They removed visible poverty and disorder from public spaces, warehoused people deemed unfit for normal society, and released them back into the same conditions that had produced the original problems. The system was circular, self-perpetuating, and remarkably resistant to reform because it served purposes beyond its stated objectives. It reassured respectable citizens that something was being done about social problems, while ensuring that fundamental economic and social structures remained unchanged. The reformatory movement specifically claimed progressive credentials, positioning itself as enlightened alternative to simple imprisonment. Reformatory advocates argued that habitual drunkards needed treatment and training rather than punishment, that extended periods in controlled environments would allow for genuine reformation. This rhetoric obscured the reality that reformatories functioned as prisons with additional moral instruction, that they offered no meaningful medical or psychological treatment, and that their success rates were dismal. But the rhetoric served important purposes. It allowed authorities to feel they were addressing problems humanely. It justified expenditure on new institutions, and it deflected criticism that might have led to more fundamental questioning of approach. The role of alcohol itself in this story requires careful consideration. Victorian England had a complicated relationship with drink. Alcohol consumption was ubiquitous across all classes, integrated into social occasions, used medicinally, and central to working-class leisure culture. Public houses served as social centres, meeting places, and sources of warmth and light in neighbourhoods where housing was often cold and dark. Temperance movements gained strength during this period, advocating for reduction or elimination of alcohol consumption, but faced enormous resistance from brewing interests and from working-class communities where drinking was culturally embedded. Cheap gin represented a particular concern. Unlike beer or wine, which required time to consume, spirits delivered rapid intoxication for minimal cost.
For poor women seeking escape from grinding poverty or emotional distress, gin offered quick relief. The phrase mother's ruin reflected awareness that gin consumption among working-class women was widespread and often destructive. Yet the solution pursued by authorities was punishment rather than addressing the conditions that drove women toward drink. The poverty, the limited options, the emotional and physical exhaustion of trying to survive on inadequate resources.